for the beginning of the spring term lecture series here at the Berlage Institute. It's our great pleasure and honor to welcome Peter Eisenman. Peter, welcome to the Berlage. Cannot be more exciting opening of our lecture series, or hardly possible, than your conversation or exchange with Elia Zenghelis in the program and the seminar which we call Fabricators of Architectural Ideologies. And as you said just a couple of minutes ago, you are the oldest living professional architect teacher, and you didn't miss any of the teaching seasons in the last 60 years. So it's Peter Eisenman.
Many of the students I have wish I would miss some.
Right. Yeah. You mean these famous practitioners, some of them? Yeah, right. Okay. Elia, please could you introduce Peter Eisenman to not only our audience here in the room here in Rotterdam, but we are streaming it live, so I'm sure that many of our alumni and other architects from all over the world are watching this.
Well, in our series that I've been trying to run on the kind of fabricators of ideology in architecture and through teaching and education in the second part of the second century and the first part of the 21st century. Today's lecture is perhaps the most important, the most exciting for me, especially personally. We got Peter Eisenman. We managed to get him to come to us. I mean, the honor that he's doing us is more than a pleasure. It's a very significant contribution to our effort. As Vedran said, Peter has been teaching. I mean, he's been teaching longer than myself. I mean, it's funny. I mean, I only started in 1963. Peter had already been doing that. If there is any fabricator of ideology, Peter Eisenman is one par excellence, one should say. And through his work and through his energy, he confirms. I mean, there's no point in introducing him any further than the fact, since everyone knows him. But what I would like to kind of stress is that he confirms a tenet that I always believed him, that I always believed that one always remains young if one, through one's work. And the amazing it is becoming manifest to me that anyway, I don't know anybody that has managed to remain and become younger as the years go by. This is something that is due to the phenomenal energy that has gone into the architectural thought and architectural production of the last 50 years. I met Peter in the 70s when I went to New York, and it was at the time when I was beginning to evolve some of my kind of fantasy projects, if you like. And I had the enormous luck to, through the hospitality of Peter, to be able to work at his institute, the Institute for Architecture and Urban Studies in New York. an environment that has been the most conducive environment for work and for creative work that have ever known. I've never met a similar environment in the most amazing space since then. I don't want to waste any more of your time by things that I say to you. I want to thank Peter and welcome Peter for coming with us today. Peter.
Thank you, Vedran and Elia. Don't you all who are standing, there's plenty of room to sit here if you want on the floor. I think it's better than standing, but I have to tell you something about standing. My mentor, Colin Rowe, said that once you reach the age of 75, you can sit to lecture. So I've reached the age of 75, I'm gonna sit. If you can't see, stand. By the way, the microphone is a little echoing. And there's plenty of room up here to sit down.
You're fine here.
I want to talk today, and I have to give acknowledgement to Pier Vittorio Reilly, who criticized my Latin. When I want to ask you a question, Pierre, that's what before. What about focus and foci? And how come we say in America foci?
It's your problem, because we can't say it should.
Anyway, Pier Vittorio and I have been talking about the Latin CI, which I was taught in my Latin very far from the source as he was at, on the footsteps of the Vatican. I was taught Veni, Vidi, Vici. And therefore, it wasn't until today that since I'm going to be talking about genius loci, as opposed to loci, because I thought the CI was a hard C, and therefore it would have given me foci or foci, loci and loci. I found out that I was not supposed to be saying Vici, but Vici. I guess the Vici and Vici are so close that I probably obliterated it from my mind. But anyway, I am going to be talking tonight about an idea of genius loci and Zeitgeist. And I believe that these two terms really define what architecture in the greatest metacritical sense has always been about. That is the dialogue between place, the genius of place, genius loci, and the genius of time, which was originally called genius seculi. I hope that's right, genius seculi, which were the oppositional terms in the 18th century until Johann Herder rightly changed genius seculi, which was the genius not of the secularity, but of the century, the genius of time. And I believe that the dialogue between these two issues accrues even to today. I want to go back and say that this dialogue between place and time and between space and time was defined for modern architecture, which was, to all intents and purposes, a zeitgeist phenomenon. And of course, you could argue that Le Corbusier's 5 points for a new architecture, or an architecture, it wasn't a new architecture then, and his 4 compositions were all about setting up the discourse of the zeitgeist, that is, the modern idea of what constituted architecture. And if one takes that as a fulcrum, one begins to read forward and back from that point to understand that while that was said in 1923, we can look at Siegfried Gideon's book, Space, Time, and Architecture, which was written in 1939, which also, in fact, defines the modern as a space-time phenomenon. Now, if we were to flip forward to today, and of course we are going to do that in the course of this lecture, we will find that space is no longer the operative discourse, but surface. And we have to ask the question, why surface? What does it mean, etc.? And all of the implications of what one would call the increasing energy of global capital on the denial, let's say, of of space as opposed to surface. We can go all the way back to the early years of the 20th century and go and look at Adolf Loos, whose Muller house was a white cube, as it were, a zeitgeist phenomenon in Vienna in the early years in Vienna. And if we look at its interior, it's full of lush materials, lush furniture, haute bourgeoisie characteristics, which talked about the making of place as comfort, as representational of a certain lifestyle. So it was zeitgeist on the outside and genius loci, I'll try and say it, on the inside. And the same thing you could say about Mies van der Rohe's Tugendhat house, which is around 1930. You could say that it is a zeitgeist house on the outside, and inside it has very beautiful wood materials, marbles and granites, and even though it was Mies's own furniture, the difference between the outside and the inside was an enormous contrast. So that, again, you can have a genius loci interior with a zeitgeist exterior. You can then point to an essay by Colin Rowe, who documents the issues in terms of the evolution of 19th century architecture as it evolved into 20th century, and where he cites the difference in 2 different terms, character and composition. And he would argue that character was something of the place. In other words, the vertical surface had to do with the relationship to the ground, whether it was English country house, a house in the city, etc. The exterior represented the conditions of character, or genius loci, whereas the interiors were basically classical compositions in terms of English houses. They started from a central core, a fireplace, and moved outward in a symmetrical fashion to an external irregular periphery, but had nothing to do with genius loci, but with a phenomenon of centralized planning evolving out of the Palladian villa several centuries before, whereas the French hotel was a classically conceived on the exterior, an enclosure on the exterior, much like the Loci house or the Mies house, and the interior was articulated in a very different way. So that composition was not tied to place, but to some external circumstances which one could consider as a Zeitgeist phenomenon. So the vertical surface, the facade, was representative of place, whereas the plans were indicative of an evolution in time. For me, it explains a lot of things. Why, when you're in school teaching, why do students draw facades the way they do? Why do they look the way they are? Well, to me, all facades, because we now have the Herzog de Meuron, Jean Nouvel grill facades, where everything has to be supposedly sustainable or green, but patterned facades. That's the latest thing. All my students do what I call chicken coop facades that come out of parametric processes, but in fact are really plays on the latest Zeitgeist. And so the facade for students, most of them can do plans based on what they consider to be program or use, which are really not plans at all, but just diagrams of utility or futility. But in any case, it is the facades where they excel, because this is where they can use Photoshop and 3D Studio Max and all those wonderful programs that give them the kind of look of today. And so whenever today is, the facade in a studio will always show you where you are. And all you have to do is go around any studio in the United States and chicken coops are in, I can tell you. And of course, students now explain their work because they don't say, we're trying to be like Herzog and de Meuron, or we're trying to be like Jean Nouvel. They say, we're interested in parametric processes and algorithms. We can produce algorithms, give us infinite variation in terms of what a building looks like. It doesn't matter what a building looks like anymore. We can decide to punch this one or push this one, etc. We get infinite variation. We can produce them for the same cost, the same function, etc. To me, the ultimate in the Zeitgeist phenomenon. Now, if we go back to where this kind of breach occurs in the hegemony of space and time, that is, between planning a plan and a facade, between the experience of the subject and the understanding of the subject through his or her experience, I think we have to pick out the date of 1972, the date of Denise Scott Brown and Robert Venturi's book, Learning from Las Vegas. Because here, in this book, was the first breakdown of the idea that space was important, and that, in fact, it was not space that was any longer important, but the surface. That surface and the politics of surface, which I'm working on an essay called Lateness and the Politics of Surface, which has to do specifically with the notion that no longer was space important, no longer was it even necessary to make space, and we had the Venturi-Scott-Brown idea of the decorated shed. So that what we did now is we spent money on the facade, and behind it we could build any old thing. And of course, there's much of architecture that, in fact, is all about the facade. And of course, they were referring to the Western towns where there were facades that were made to look like a post office, a library, a bar, a hotel, etc. And then behind them were the same sheds. And the notion that the decorated shed was in, and the duck, or the building that was spatial, but it looked like what it was, like the famous Long Island duck that sold ducks, or a hamburger stand that looked like a hamburger. This was out in favor of the decorated shed. Now, basically, what the decorated shed was about was what one could say is an accommodation with capital. In other words, that postmodern's first energy was about the denial of space and time, necessarily in that sense, as an important components of what an architecture should be. That is, the denial of the Siegfried Giedian space-time, of the Le Corbusian idea of space, of the Mies van der Rohe idea, etc., that we now could deploy our meaning on a surface. And all one had to do is to look at the images in Learning from Las Vegas, and one has to realize that not only was this the death knell of modern architecture, but for me, it concluded the end of what would possibly have been architecture's possible relationship to the ever-expanding needs of global capital. Now, so what you have is in a sense, a zeitgeist phenomenon, which is against place. In other words, place becomes unimportant. And how do I see the evolution of this? Well, I asked Denise Scott Brown, if it were today, where would she go to make the critique that she made in 1972? And of course, she answered to me that it would be impossible to go any place, because all places are the same. They have all become like Las Vegas. When, for example, in the old days, I would want to go to Paris to buy my wife a very fancy gift from Hermès, I knew where to go in Paris. There was a place. Now I can find Hermès in any number of cities throughout the world, not least of which is Las Vegas. I think Las Vegas has 11 Hermès stores. So place is no longer important. As a man, I used to buy my clothes at a place called Brooks Brothers, the equivalent of sort of lower class version of Savile Row in London, which also was a place, a genius Loci. Brooks Brothers was on Madison Avenue. Madison Avenue was a wonderful place. Now you can buy Brooks Brothers clothes in airports from Florida to wherever, because place is no longer important in global capital. That is, the genius Loci and the Zeitgeist have become contaminated with one another. In Las Vegas, there is a Venetian hotel with a replica of the Grand Canal. There's now a replica of the Grand Canal in India. I think one is coming in Singapore, so that the replica of real places have, replaced the actual place itself. And to me, both terms have lost any kind of critical validity in the terms of being a metacritical discourse. That is, how do you make a place when place is no longer of value in the capitalist society, in other words, and how do you make something of our time when of our time has nothing to do with place or the particular moment in time that we're in? Because if I were to say to you, what is it that's in today? it's very hard to know because everything is constantly new. And that is because not only we're in a world of capital, we're also in a world of media. And media has one thing that's interesting about it is that it is constantly revising the present. In other words, the present is not allowed to exist for very long, because every day there has to be a newspaper. That was traditional, but now there has to be a news program on television that is 24 hours a day. So constantly to keep, or on the internet. I check the internet CNN news at least 6 times a day. What do I expect to find? Who knows? Why do I need to do that? I mean, the real question is, what is it about my life that is so problematic that I check CNN news, and I will do that when I go back to my hotel tonight. What am I checking? For what do I expect to have happened? And why do I need to know right away? And of course, these are the issues that I think one has to ask one questions about as to what it is that we're doing. Now, media, what they need for architecture, because architecture is a very mediated profession, they need constant newness. In other words, they want difference. And of course, the problem for star architects is the structure between media and their clients. The clients hire X architect, and you can fill in the names, because they are of media value. We sell ourselves because we can make the Italian newspapers, the Spanish newspapers, the German newspapers. I mean, thanks to Pier Vittorio, we even have the Pope coming to our opening of our project that we're going to see tonight. Now, whoever else has the Pope coming, I mean, that's a big deal, right? Well, it's going to be in a media event. Does the Pope care about our building? No. Do we? I mean, I care about the Pope in abstract form, but in reality, he's just another archbishop. But the thing is, the fact he's coming, I'm so excited. Why? Because we're going to get tons of media, right? And do I like media? Yes. But when the Pope goes away, the buildings are going to be the same. The architecture is going to be the same. Nobody's going to be any better or for any worse. But nevertheless, we will be involved in media. Now, the problem is this, that my clients see this, they see the project, and they say, we want you to do what you did in Santiago, or we want you to do what you did in Berlin, or we want you to do whatever, right? And the interesting thing is they want you to do it because that's what got you into the media. But what they don't realize, the media don't want you to do the same thing because they won't publish the same thing. And so therefore, if you get the projects because of media, you will also never be in the media. And so you have to constantly revise what you are doing, not for the client's sake, but for the whole media impulse. Now, of course, I'm in one sense cartooning the reality of the situation, but in fact, it is true. We have a client that I'm going to see tomorrow in Milano. We got the project because they want us to do a radical project in the context that we're involved in terms of the square meters required, in terms of the zoning requirements, in terms of the setback requirements, in terms of all these requirements, is not possible to do. But we have to, as it were, look like we're doing a radical project. Now, I would believe that 90% of what many of us are ever asked to do in practice involves work that can never be considered critical because the conditions for criticality and what that would mean are impossible. The second thing is that how many ideas which are critical can a single architect have in a lifetime? I would argue very few. What you don't realize, because you're all about from 25 to 35 years old, that you're someday going to be 75, right? And what the hell are you going to do when you're 75, when all your ideas, and if you have them, will have been done by 25 to 35? Think about that as a phenomenon. Your teachers don't tell you about that, but it's quite true that there are no new ideas, and especially as you grow older. Realizing that age comes upon one and is relentless, I have begun to think about a term which I call lateness, which is an attitude toward ideas that has nothing to do with newness. And the thesis that I am putting forward tonight, and which I would like to show you in our building project that I'm going to show you, has to do with the fact that I believe that in cycles of history, there are the avant-garde movements. We can catalog those. They could have been in the late 15th and earliest 16th century in Italy. They could be at the time of the Counter-Reformation in Rome. They could have been in the late 18th century in Italy and in France, the early 19th century in Germany, the late 18th century in America. The moments where there are paradigm or epistemic, in Foucault's terms, shifts. And those happen maybe every 80 or 90 years. It's not clear how the cycle works. But there's no question that modernism as a beginning, really you could argue is approximately 1914, just before the start of the First World War. It lasts the avant-garde period. Maybe it's 1919. I always date it from the Maison Domino of Le Corbusier. A lot of people date modernism back to Piranesi's Campo Marzio. A lot of them date it back to the Palladian Villa. I mean, there are any number of places where one could say there was an epistemic or paradigm shift. In any case, from after World War II in 45, modern architecture changed from what it was as an idea of the good society, that is, promoting social well-being, as it were, a movement of the left, to being taken over by the good life, by capital. And it arrived in the United States as a feeling, an era of goodwill, of plenty after the Second World War, and was taken over by corporate headquarters. All of the famous designers, from Saarinen to Pei to Johnson to Rudolph, were Mies van der Rohe's Seagram building is an excellent case of architects being used to design the image of the good life. That was the high period of modern architecture, totally subscribed by forces and ideas different from what the original intentions of modernism were. So that 68 and the revolution of 68, we have the critical period against this takeover by market forces. And we have the Mannerist phase, the critical phase of postmodernism. I believe that postmodernism begins in around 1968 and dies around 1988 with the deconstructivist show at MoMA, which purported to be a revolutionary show, which we realize today was just another one of those dying gasps of the third phase or critical Mannerist phase of architecture. Then there was supposedly the revolution. Everybody is always looking for a revolution. The revolution, the digital revolution, which never turned out to be such, in the 90s. And, and now we have what I call Rococo modernism, which is the ultimate last end of whatever it was, without any new on the horizon. In other words, there is nothing that we see to be paradigmatically new. So I would argue that there's a very poignant moment in time that occurs in the late 16th century in Italy, which is between the Mannerist critique of people like Vignola and Serlio and Peruzzi and others, and before we get to Borromini and Bernini and Guarini in the Counter-Reformation, there is a moment in Italian architecture which Manfredo Tafuri characterizes as sprezzatura, which is a way of speaking, using language that is critical without seeming to be critical, which is not new and not old, but an investigation of language itself. And Tafuri cites Jacopo Sansovino as one of the architects of this idea of sprezzatura, which is after a critical period. And I would also cite Vincenzo Scamozzi's work as a work of sprezzatura in the same vein as Sansovino's. But in any case, it is a moment after there is no purchase in criticality or high or avant-garde. And Theodor Adorno and Edward Said have both talked about this phenomenon in music, in painting, in literature, which they called, in Adorno's case, Spätstil, which is late style, and Edward Said talks about lateness. And they both use Beethoven as an example, that Beethoven, in his late age, was faced with a late moment in time where you could do nothing but, as it were, work on the language. And of course, they cite the Missa Solemnis of Beethoven as a completely anarchic, non-understandable work in terms of Beethoven's music in his entire career, which represents a going back into language to study the possibility of music itself. Now, for several reasons, I lecture about lateness. One, because I'm late, all right? Ain't nothing I can do about it. I'm late. I ain't got new ideas. All the new ideas I've had were done, as Jeff Kipner said, in the first act and second act. I think we're in the epilogue, not even in the third act, but, you know, we're going to make it go as long as we can. But for me, involved in this, I also believe that lateness as outside of the individual person, but as a moment in time, is also a fabulous moment to look at the possibility of language, the possibility of discipline. And I cite an American author, Thomas Pynchon, who wrote a book recently called Against the Day. Now, Against the Day is a parable about a moment of time that Pynchon, he's also in his late 70s, finds himself in, and not only in terms of literary work, because he did his masterpiece, Gravity's Rainbow, he did Crying of Lot 49. He is a great American author. And if anybody wants to read a great novel of the high period of postmodern thought, one reads Gravity's Rainbow, as one reads Faulkner's Light in August as the high period of let's say, avant-garde modernist literature in the 20s and 30s. But anyway, Pynchon writes a book about a phenomenon which is also in its time as late. That is the Chicago World's Fair, which was supposed to be pointing towards a new paradigm, but in fact could only be, as it were, a late phenomenon. And it was not realized that the avant-garde wasn't possible. And the project that he writes about is the fact that surrounding this late condition in the late 19th century were all sorts of possibilities of the new which couldn't have been seen at the time. And he characterizes these as, space travel, space balloons, mechanisms of all sorts, train travel, elevators, fantastic mechanisms that he describes that were around but didn't quite add up to a new paradigm. And what Pynchon is saying is, first of all, Against the Day is a very interesting title. So it's against the light as opposed to the darkness, and maybe to look in the darkness we will find the future. I sincerely believe that that is possible. So I'm using the time to think again the possibility of work in a critical matrix, as PV and I were just talking about it, the possibility of the critique of the metaphysical project, which supposedly is what the architectural project is, the possibility of it, as PV says, within a capital project that has already eaten up the metaphysical project. And of course, he raises a crucial point. So what I'm going to do tonight is to show you a project that deals with both Genius Loci and Zeitgeist, attempts to find a way to think place, to think site, to think time, to think the time of experience in a project that we are building now. It is in itself a late work of mine. I think it is a summary of many of the other projects that I've done. I don't think it is a new project. It is perhaps a very old project. But I think that one of the issues which operating at this particular time, which makes it a new project, is the question of scale. And we all know that it's impossible just to do small projects. Museums cannot have small shows. They have to have blockbuster shows. Art fairs have got to have blockbuster accommodation. Developers can no longer build single sites. They have to put package sites and put them together in blockbuster deals. And so the blockbuster, whether it's mega stores or mega complexes of things which are like small cities in themselves, the scale of project has changed. And so we were asked to do a project that is 1,500,000 square feet or 150,000 square meters, which is a large project for supposedly a theoretical office. We were asked to do 6 buildings at the same time. Now, I think it's a difficult thing to try and do 6 buildings, not as one building, but 6 different experiences. And so what I'm going to show you tonight is a project that clearly is of its time. It is an $800 million project. Can you make a project of $800 million that's critical? That's a very interesting question. Can you make a building, a project of 6 buildings at the same time that's a critical project? That's a question. I can't answer those questions. I put them up to show you. I find it an extraordinary fact that we are building this project and that the Pope is coming to open it. That's even more exciting. Things like that don't happen to me every day. We had first had the King and Queen of Spain were coming, and now we find out that the Pope is coming, and therefore Pier Vittorio is coming, so we're really excited. Anyway, let's take a look at some pictures, and then we'll have some time for a few questions. Vedran, who's running the? You're running. Okay. What do I do? Where's the pointer? Remember I said I needed a pointer. There was a pointer coming.
It's in this drawer.
Rob.
It's a bit difficult to open right now. But yeah. Here we go. Just one button, so that's easy.
Okay. Can we turn the lights out? You see, Elia, I didn't use my notes. I had them here in case I lost it. I got almost everything. And I didn't once mention Rem Koolhaas, which is amazing, in Rotterdam.
Save him for a question.
For me?
No.
Can we have the next one, please? Vedran, we have to. Okay. This was, and I am going to mention Rem now because he was in this competition. This was a competition between the star architects. It had Jean Nouvel, Danny Libeskind, Rem Koolhaas, Stephen Hall, Juan Navarro, and on and on and on, Ricardo Bofill. There were 10 architects, and we were asked to submit. It's a city of culture. It's a library, an archive building, a study center, an opera house, and 2 museums. This was the program. And what we did was we always try and think what the other people are going to do. And trying to get between. We're trying to figure out how to get between Stephen Hall, Danny, Rem, Jean Nouvel. That was really a tight squeeze. That bus was full, right? So we knew we couldn't do that, and we've been working for a long time with ground figure projects, figuring the ground becoming figure. And so we did a project like this where we chopped the no, I don't think so. It's really teeny. We chopped the hillside off the project, built the hill again, and we're cut by the map of the old streets of Santiago. We were the only people that did this. There's in a recent publication which shows all the competition schemes. We were clearly at least different, if not better. But we were given the project, and we've been working on this project for the last 11 years. This is how long it takes to do a large-scale project. Next, please. This was one of the diagrams that we sent in, which showed the relationship between the structural systems and the structure in these fine grids, and then the other were the vectors, we call them ley lines, which operate in the, first of all, in the medieval times. The discovery of Santiago was supposedly through Druid readings of ley lines and the stars. There's a whole mystical thought about, that's why the place is called Compostela, Field of Stars. And Santiago is St. James, and they knew that they had found St. James's body, who had been brought by the Crusaders to this place, Finisterre, the end of the earth, in the 12th century, because on the coffin were, thank you, sir, scallop shells. And the scallop shell, any Jewish notable who died in the 1st century was buried in a coffin with scallop shells. So the scallop shell, the Coquille Saint-Jacques, became the sort of logo of Santiago. Next. And there is the scallop shell, and you can see it in the site plan. These were again drawings that we sent in. The drawing on the left was the actual medieval street pattern that we took from the town and placed it on the hillside. Because this is one of the three, Jerusalem and Rome being the others, famous pilgrimage cities. This year, which is the Jacobeo, the year that St. James's birthday falls on a Sunday, Santiago will have 12 million pilgrims, compared to, say, the Vatican, which has about 3 million a year. 12 million is quite a lot. We then took that pattern and took the topography of the hill. This is on a flat topography, and penetrated through with the topography, distorting this grid and overlaying it with the topography. And then the ley lines that you saw in the other project, the vectoral lines that we were able to generate on the computer, gave us the final distortion of the site as we were going to map it. Next, please. And here is the site plan that we're building. Here is the archive building, which you'll see, the library building, which you will see, the study center, which you'll see, and this museum, which you'll see. These two buildings, the Opera House is under construction, and this is the sixth building, which hasn't begun construction. So we're opening 4 buildings in November. Here is the site plan, which is all about the overlay of these grids, and then the continuity, the continuation of the pilgrimage routes from the secular city down to the town, to the sacred city. Next, please. There's this site plan as it exists, the archive building, the library building, the beginning of the Opera House building, the study center building, and the Museum of Galicia, and the whole over here being the second museum. To give you a sense of the scale, this is a 12,000 seat indoor arena for basketball. So that's the size of that compared to this complex. There is the church in the central square downtown. So it's about less than a kilometer down the hill to the church. And this is the highway access, the main road from La Coruña, eventually to Madrid. It goes right past our site. Next, please. An up-close view of the, and all of these markings that you see are part of the realization in 3 dimensions, both interior and exterior of the project, both as it's etched in the roof and as you'll see in the soffits and the floors of the buildings. So there isn't a single datum, and that you'll see that in a couple of slides, the whole idea of the datum between the soffits of the undersides of the roof and the floor. Next, please. An up close of the facade of the, in quotes, of the archive building. I mean, yeah, the archive building. These are 2 towers. They're important for me and for the project. They were done by John Haydock, who was one of the 5 architects. John was an ardent Catholic and designed many churches in his later life. Found out he was dying of cancer, lost faith in the idea of the body, his body and the body of the church. And so he designed, as it were, a west facade of a church, the twin towers of a west facade without a body. On his deathbed, I promised John we would build these. We went to the president, built these before with John's drawings, before we even started construction on our buildings. And if you stand just about where this person is standing, looking through the 2 towers, they frame the west facade of the cathedral downtown. So there is the play, the iconic nature of these in relationship to the church downtown. Next, please. The facade at dusk. Next, entrance to the archive building. Next. Now this is an important slide for me because this is the first space that you enter. It has a glass floor, and the reason for the glass floor is the reflection of the soffit and its lines onto the floor, so that you realize that the space between, that there is no single datum. It's not the ground nor the roof, but in fact it's the surfaces, both the horizontal surfaces, the floor and the ceiling, and that the space between is only the connection between the two. This was the same thing that we did in Berlin with the Holocaust Memorial. We had a topological surface on the ground, which was not the ground. We had another topological surface, an imaginary one, which was not the same as the one on the ground. And the vertical pillars are only the connectivity between those surfaces. So it's a different kind of sandwich of space as to the Maison Domino or Mies van der Rohe's sandwich of space in his umbrella projects. This is a play between two topological surfaces and their connections. Next, please. So the soffits become important as well as their reflections in the floor. Next. And here you can see another part of that glass floor. This is all in the interior of the archive building. Next, please. Next. And of course, there's a very, for me, what I would like to consider a Piranesian section, which occurs in each of the buildings as they move not only longitudinally, but laterally across to the other buildings next to it. And there's a level here, a level down here, and a level here that cascades through very much like Piranesi's Carcery drawings. Again, all of the lines on the floor are part of the overall lines, the square columns, the round columns denoting different scale grids, the compression of space in these soffits, the way they're lit. All of these things are part of the overall conceptual strategy of the project, taken to an elaborate means because the fact we're dealing with 6 buildings to produce differentiated space. Next, please. Different systems of lighting depending on the spaces that they're dealing with. Next. 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 Now we're going to see the, that's the baby building we were looking at. This is the library building. It will have a tail which is being constructed now, which goes out. All of these buildings have these tails that go out into the landscape here as well. So they're not just object buildings, but flatten into the landscape. Next. And this is the library building. You can see the stacks here rising, you know, in consort with the rest of the project. And again, a level up here, a level down here, and a level below where the rare books are. Next. I'm sorry, these slides are a bit washed out. These are new slides that we just got, and I hadn't seen them before, but they seem, unfortunately, a bit washed out. There's a better one. Some of the light hasn't been corrected in these, but you can see that we're talking about not a curtain wall, but a very elaborate substructure for the facades of the building. Next. Next. for me, the compression of space between an interior glass facade and the soffits of the roof now becoming as if it were internal facades is some of the things that I'm interested in when I look at what we are doing. And again, an interior facade, an exterior facade, the columns taking up a lot of the space, the shelves. So there's little room, as it were, for people, if you want, which is, for me, a positive thing. You know, who let people into my building? Frank Lloyd Wright's famous thing when his client called in the middle of the night and said, "Mr. Wright, our roof is leaking," and Mr. Wright said, "You left the building out in the rain?" Next. This is the study center building, also a smaller building. Here you can see the beginnings of the Opera House building, the foundation walls, the parking decks, and the beginning of these walkways through the space, very narrow, the same dimensions as the walkways in Old Santiago. Next, please. Again, the archive building, looking at the museum building, and you can see the levels of the facade as the building, it's a double curved surface. There's not a piece of glass that's the same, all coming out of iterations of a Rhino model. Next, please. The interior of the archive building. This is the front of the archive building. It twists about this very strange column here, and don't ask me to explain this because 10 years ago I remembered why we did it. I can't remember today, but there clearly must have been a reason. It just doesn't look like a constructional mistake. Again, the archive building, looking at the museum. Next. Now, this is a very interesting project, the museum. This facade also is a very complex three layers of glass, where even the gaskets on each frame of glass are twisted in order to get a double curved surface and have flat planes of glass. The stonework is, first of all, this incline, we had trouble. The waterproof of the roof is this gray surface here, concrete surface. We had difficulty allowing it to settle on, spraying it onto the surface because it wanted to slump down and not hold its shape. So we spent a lot of time trying to get the appropriate mix of the concrete. This is a 3-meter high steel grid which allows the stone to be put on over all of the chases, pipes, plumbing, vents, ducts, whatever that come through roofs which spoil a roofscape. They're all hidden, but behind this 3-foot high grid, 10-foot, 3-meter high grid, and then the stone is placed, each of these pieces of stone, they're meter wide, are placed with 4 screws and grommets onto this steel frame, and so they're not waterproof. The water runs through it, but will give you the sense of being a stone building. Next. And there you can see from this side the sort of the facade twists this way, but it twists from being in over here to vertical to twisting out above. So it's a very complex, is one of the most complex facades we've ever done. It was the last facade we did. This is the museum building. Next, please. And you can see them just starting to fill in some of the glass panels and the excavation for the library and the final building, which will fill up this area here. Next. There's a close-up of the subframe steel and the aluminum, which then take the glass, and you can see in each of these angles, there's a different angle as it goes, so that each piece of glass fills up a different component of this subframe. There you can see them installing each glass panel into the subframe of the steel. Inside, you can see we took these shots before they put the plaster over. This is the subframe for the soffits, and of course, difficulty detailing when the aluminum got near the steel over here. Problems of separation, and this is where all the pipes are covered in the soffits in the space. Next, all of this has now been, I show these slides just to show the complex organization of the construction of the soffits and the steel. Next. I think for me, this last shot, an important shot because, number one, it very rarely snows in Santiago, and there's this sense of strangeness with the clouds, strange fog bank of clouds, and the strangeness of these shapes covered in snow. For me, says more about what this project's about than any of the other images. Thank you very much.
Peter Eisenman, thank you a lot for microphone.
Yeah.
Peter Eisenman, thank you very much for this answer to actually our question. And when we put this invitation in front of you, we really, you kind of really perfectly answer, if I may say, the way in which we don't want to discuss on Fabricators of their architectural ideologies in retrospect, but
no.
in a kind of anticipation of not really what comes next after the, how you call that, Rococo.
Yeah.
Or casino capitalism, some people would say, which maybe go together with, you know, but more the kind of phenomena which you then explain through your, concept of lateness and the way in which. What struck me personally is this kind of question which you put in front: are we educating architects to never retire? Or are we kind of in a belief that our profession basically cannot be exhausted for almost one life working time cycle, and that we kind of travel with the history, you know, until basically to the last day?
Well, architects who retire are, for me, there are several kinds of architects. There are commercial architects, there are professional architects. 90% of all things that are built, first of all, are not built by architects. So we don't even know who signs those papers. I'm talking about the other 10%, 9% of them are basically in the commercial world. They have to do the libraries, the town halls, the churches, the factories, the schools, you know. And how are they supposed to know what makes a critical work? And indeed, they are not interested in that. They're interested in solving the client's problems. And why shouldn't they be? Why should we worry about them? So, number one, we're not talking about those people. And there are thousands of people being educated all over this world who are not in this room, wait a minute, who don't want to be here, and these people don't want to be like them. So therefore, they've always existed. They exist more and more. And the people who are in this room are interesting to us because they are here. How did they get here? How do people get to my office? You know, why do they get there? And so these people are here, and they expect something, right? They expect that being here will help them to reach a certain moment of fulfillment of what they believe either practicing architecture, teaching architecture, writing it means, right? And those are the people we care about. As I was saying to Rob, we had 1,100 applicants for 50 places at Yale, all right? 1,100. I mean, my God. So they go somewhere, right? And they don't come to Yale, that 1,050. They may aspire to being there, but they don't get there. You have 60 students altogether. There may be hundreds who aspire to come here. The world is full of people who fall by the wayside. I mean, you know, they get married, they, you know, do whatever, right? Have kids, they want, you know, etc., right? You know, those things that stand in the way of our existence.
Immortality.
Yeah. So I think that what their aspirations are and what their hopes are, as I wouldn't be teaching if I didn't believe that they can reach what it is in their time is what it is, right? In my time, I was fortunate to be in the 70s. Elia and I believe we were fortunate. Other people would say we missed being in Berlin in the 20s. Other people would say we missed being in France in 1820. You know, other great moments in time. I believe the 70s in New York were fantastic. People were there. New York is not the same. New York is not a place that I would want to, I am there because I live there. But if I wanted to go somewhere, I don't know where I would go. Is there a there anywhere? And that's why I think it's a moment in time. It's hard for a 25-year-old to say this, but to reflect, will there be a new paradigm? I believe so. Will there be a new paradigm in their lifetime? No question, right? Dead periods or late periods don't last that long. And so what they need to do, it's like exercising. You know, if you're going to run a race in the Olympics, you don't just run once every 4 years. You're practicing, whatever you do, you're practicing. So as far as I'm concerned, who's going to give any of these people a chance to build before they're 50? Nobody, not even for PV. Especially not. So he's practicing, right? And if you realize that and you're patient, what I think is important about life as an architect is you have to be patient. I mean, 11 years we've been working on this, and you think I'm interested in this anymore? I mean, really, it's nice that the Pope is coming, right? But you know, I've got other things I'm interested in. You know, this is done as far as I'm concerned. I think one has to have enormous patience and realize that our ideas, if you want to build, take a long time to not only to germinate, but to realize. That I think patience and risk at the same time. I believe that everybody has to learn that in order to do anything like this, somewhere along the line, I took a risk. I got out. I can remember a teacher saying I was working with Walter Gropius. And to me, working with Walter Gropius, I'd reached the epitome of life. And it was awful, right? I mean, he was a fraud as far as I was concerned. And so I went back to my teacher and I said, what can I do? And he said, well, you have two choices. Work your way up, you know, become a junior partner, then a partner, an associate or whatever, in the corporate world and be a corporate architect. Or you can go back to school, get a master's or a PhD like I did, and become totally useless. Because once you get a PhD, you are destroyed for being in that world, honestly. And, you know, we have witness, you know, here we are. What are we doing here? And no, you know too much and can do too little, right? That's why faculties of architecture or any place are awful places to be, because they fight over nothing, because there's nothing at stake. So that I believe that taking risks and being patient are two phenomenon that will serve anybody well. If you don't have, it's not a question of talent, intelligence, it's a question of how much risk are you willing to take and how patient are you going to be until, you know, your stack of chips runs out, all right? And, you know, you also have a certain intuition, like this project. We bet the ranch on this project. In other words, we spent probably close to $250,000 to $300,000 doing this project. We received 60 or 70, right? So, you know, I'm constantly broke because I'm betting the ranch, you know, but you have to know when to place the bets. And I like placing bets against tough competition. I mean, we're against Zaha for this parliament building in Abu Dhabi. Now, what a dumb thing to do. But I like that kind of bet, you know. You know, sure, Zaha's going to get it, but, you know, what the hell?
And you mean to express the goal of democracy, right?
Yeah, that's right, right. So you know, I love teaching. I love the fact that we have people here who have the aspiration, right? And I am an idealist. Ultimately, I'm not a cynic. I'm an idealist. I'm not a negative person. I believe that some people in this room will survive, right? You know, in one way or another. They will choose, and all of them will survive because they will all choose and make it seem that's what they wanted, right? It may not be what they wanted today. I didn't start out to be either an architect or a teacher. I have to understand I never heard the word architect until I was 18. So, you know, here we are. And I love coming here to speak because I can talk about ideas. I'd like to, I mean, well, while Elia and I may disagree about the term ideology, you know, in Marxist terms, ideology and theory are problematic terms. We may be talking about theory rather than ideology, but since we're both fabricators, which means liars, it doesn't really...
or producers.
Oh, yeah, liars is really, and I know Elia and I both survived by lying a lot. And I don't mean lying flat, which we also have done, but the English language is very mobile. Let's go. Any?
Survivors? From survivors questions? I can ask 100 questions.
There's one down there.
Here we have one survivor.
You have to stand up. Yeah.
Sorry. There are a lot of architects in USA who doing the practice with basing. Yeah, personally, I think with basing on your origins. Let's say that kind of form architecture. For example, Ryzen or Memoto or yeah, kind of paperless architect. What kind of comment can you give to them, and yeah, what kind of future you can expect to them? To their practices.
Well, first of all, I think there are good architects, good young architects in every country, not just in the U.S. and are in Europe, etc. I think that I never give advice to Jesse Reiser, who is a former student of mine. He doesn't need my advice, nor Stephen Hall, nor Greg Lynn, a student of mine. There are a lot of my students who are well on their way, and it's to exhibit the patience necessary. That's all I think. I tell all of my people who are now approaching 40 two things. If they're women, I say you better have kids quick. Number one, because if you've been waiting this long, better have them now and worry about architecture later. And number two, if they're men, I say you got 10 more years until you're 50. I didn't go into private practice. I did the houses, but I didn't go into private practice till I was 50. In '82, I started my practice, and so. I was probably afraid to go into practice. So my only advice to anybody who's under 50 and a woman who's under 40 are slightly different. But I have several young women who I really think are terrific. And, they're between 30 and 40. So I say, hey, guys, there are other things to do as well. Of course, that's what makes us different. I don't have to worry about that.
Hi, I would like to ask you a question concerning the issue of criticality.
Yeah.
You have been mentioning it a lot at the beginning of the conference and all along your lecture. What do you think being critical could be nowadays? Because you've been mentioning it, you've been saying that, well, it seems it's not possible when you're managing this big budget, these incredibly big projects, but from your position in this important position you are in media, this really big office, don't you think it would be easier to be critical? And what it would be about? What is being critical nowadays?
No, I think it's more difficult when you're supposedly successful to be critical than it is when you're not successful. I think because you try and sustain yourself, and in trying to sustain yourself, you're not thinking as critically, number one. Now, I didn't mention, which came up in our seminar today, but the whole project of the metaphysical project and the notion of undecidability and the question of science. I didn't go into all of that stuff today. But I've been, I believe the same issues that apply to what I was thinking about in the 70s and 80s and 90s, since there is no new paradigm of philosophic thought that I know other than post-structuralism, I think apply today to you as well as to me. I'm not as interested in dealing with those things. I don't worry about them as much as I used to because I have other things that I'm interested in. I'm interested in building. I'm interested in building big projects. I'm interested in building, different kinds of projects, and not as much interest. And my critical interests are basically in my teaching and my writing. So a lot of what I do, I write all the time, and I'm teaching all the time. So I think it's my practice of building. I can't say whether this is a critical project or not. I'm too involved in it. People will say, how does it compare to Wexner? There are certain critical projects in my oeuvre of work. I'm less worried about how history will read the critical nature of my projects, to be honest. Pushing criticality up a hill, that big rock hanging around your neck, the requirement to be critical is not as important to me as building buildings today. So I have to confess that I'm less anxious about that rock around my neck, but it's still I remember it. I remember its weight, let's say. I'd be much more interested in how you view the possibility of criticality today, because I think it's just as potent today as it ever was. I think it's more difficult when you're in my position in terms of my career as opposed to where you are in your career. I think you can have a much more effect on the possibility of a critical project than I can, to be honest. I mean, the epilogue or the third act is not the act that is, you know, it's like the end game in chess. I believe the end game in chess is one of the most interesting games, but to understand the critical nature of the end game is the most problematic. Books of critical evolution of chess usually involve chess openings and the middle game. The more difficult game to write about is the end game. And so I believe that, you know, I'm in an end game mode, and more difficult to ascertain whether the work is critical or not, to be frank.
It seems like vibrant cities need good social interaction, good infrastructure, and nature in some kind of form. And maybe 19th century parks, the great 19th century parks, were a sort of fulfillment of the promise of an urban nature, a kind of sublime second nature. And in the modern era, there became this kind of very divisive moment where it was, you had the mechanics and the organics, maybe something like that. And in your dissertation, you were picking up a bit with this, covering Corbusier's work as well as Wright's, and I was interested if you think maybe the next paradigm has anything to do with this, as now we're entering an era where the majority of the population live in urban areas, but ostensibly civilization is still based on agriculture, so maybe that fundamental challenge is still unanswered.
Well, first of all, the digital and the computer has given us the possibility of fabricating nature in a different way. I was just reading a magazine showing new luxury liners with parks in the middle of their I mean, you know, which to me is absurd. You know, a boat's a boat, a park's a park. I don't think there should be floating boats with parks. I'm interested in the possibility of the fabrication of nature in a very different way through computation. I don't know what that would mean. I don't think we need to be nostalgic about the 19th century, that's for sure. Look, I have a country house and I have a pied-à-terre in a city. I get scared alone in my country house, right? I don't like to be in the country. I'm anti-nature, okay? I don't like Frank Lloyd Wright. I never did. You know, I wrote about him because I thought it was an important thing to do to really understand what I didn't like about him. I like the anonymity of the city. I like living in an apartment house where 500 apartments. I don't know who my neighbors are. I don't care. Nobody bothers me. I don't have little old ladies coming with pies next door in the country saying, you come to dinner, you know, and you can't, to tea, and you're going bananas, right? No, I hate neighborliness, right? So I'm an urban cat, and my kids have been grown up in the city. You can bring kids up in the city. It's okay, right? They do drugs the same in the country as the city, right? So access is equal. And since I've raised 4 kids, none of them talk to me, right? You know, they want to talk to a 77-year-old. You know, how come Daddy's so old? You know, how can I help it? That's why I teach, because my students don't give me these kinds of problems. So, can I tell you what? Don't ask me about goddamn nature. I don't care about nature, right? You know, I have a country full of nature. You want to see nature? Come and drive around the United States, right? you know, and meet the kind of people that it fosters, right? And then you'll be really happy to come back here. And you know what? If you like nature, be a landscape architect, right? I mean, you know.
He is the landscape architect.
Good.
Yeah.
And I love landscape architects.
Final question?
There's somebody here.
Yeah, here.
He asked a question before, this guy. That's all right. Well, you can do another one.
I know I should not be asking you what is coming next, because
You should be asking you.
Yes.
I
Yes,
held
you
up the
do.
mirror for you.
Yeah, but do we at least have right set of questions that we should be asking? Is it about publicness or privateness, collective, individual, generic, specific? Do you have any idea what kind of question we should be asking in order to get to the entrance of what is coming next?
You see, I think that's a good question because I'm not a futurologist, so I think it's fair to say, Peter, what kind of questions should I as a student or a young architect be asking? And I can't teach the future. I don't teach, when I teach my design projects in sort of design studio, which I require me to teach, which I think is the biggest waste of time in the world. I'm really against the studio method, but I teach them, here's an architect in Venice in 1560. Alvise Cornaro did a symbolic, fantastic, iconic Elia project in 1560. If Elia were to do a project today in Venice that would have the same impact as Cornaro's project did in 1560 in Venice, what would it be, right? And then let Elia use his imagination to answer that question. Those are the kinds of, and so I give the students no sight, no genius Loci, no Zeitgeist, because I don't know, and I say, here we are. Now, I could just as easily say, given Elia Zenghelis' Sphinx Hotel in 1972 or 3, what it meant for New York symbolically and to a generation of young architects, what would an Elia do today in New York, right? I could easily give a project like that. So therefore, what I'm asking is you have to study the relationship of a certain project to a certain time in history, figure out what that certain time might be today, and design a project, right? Now, my students go crazy doing this. I mean, it's a really nasty kind of exercise to give them because they all think architecture, you gotta have a program, a site. You know, I can't work without a program and a site. So when you give them projects like this, they can't be architects. And so what I like to do is destabilize the notions that what they assume architecture to be. We all live in a house, we all go to school, we all go to church, etc. So they all think they know these things, right? But that's not what architecture is about. Everybody and nobody is an architect. And so what I say to you is, don't ask me what kind of questions to ask. Make up a situation where you pretend Elia now exists in 2010, which he doesn't. And what would he do in 2010 that he would have done in 72? Not what he would really do today, but would he have, if it's the same Elia as 72? Those are the kind of questions. So you go back to history and you look at projects like Cornaro, or you look at Ledoux, or you look at Le Corbusier, and say, what would they did in their time that was radical? They had to figure something out. Go figure it out. And what I teach is the historical examples of people who figured out what the problem was, took a risk in their own time, and did it, okay? And whatever the consequences. So that's, if you were my student, I'd say, okay, buddy, let's go look at X, Y, and Z, figure out what they did, and there's a pattern to what they did, right? Figure out what they would do today. You're no dummy. You don't know any worse or less than anybody else does what it means today, right? And do a project, right? That's what I would teach, and that's what I believe, that today is your time, not my time. I can only give you a little insight in what it was like then and what it was like to look at the past then, etc. Now is now. And just what I would say, there are only 2 words. Just be. Okay? Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you
very much for illuminating us with your epilogues here at the Berlage Institute. Thank you.